The garage smelled of stale oil and decades of neglect. Dave stood in the center of the concrete floor, his fingers tracing the edge of a heavy, metallic object hidden behind a stack of moth-eaten holiday decorations. It was a chaotic assembly of brass gears, exposed copper wiring, and steam-pressured gauges. He pulled the last crate away, revealing the full extent of the machine. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a clockmaker's fever dream. Dave did not hesitate. He wiped a thick layer of gray dust from the control panel, his movements fluid and careless. There was a single, oversized red button centered on the dashboard. He shrugged, his shoulders clicking, and slammed his palm down onto the surface. The reaction was instantaneous. A high-pitched whine tore through the garage, followed by the smell of ozone and searing metal. Sparks erupted from the base, showering the floor in white-hot embers. The machine shuddered, vibrating with such intensity that the tools on the nearby workbench rattled and fell. The air around him began to warp, twisting into a blinding, swirling vortex of spinning clock faces and jagged light. The garage walls seemed to melt away into the void, pulling Dave forward into the collapsing center of the machine. The vortex collapsed with a wet thud. Dave landed face first into scorching sand, the heat radiating through his frame instantly. Above, the sun burned white, beating down on thousands of workers struggling to drag massive stone blocks across the dunes. The scale of the labor was immense, yet progress was agonizingly slow. Dave stood up, shook the sand from his joints, and approached the Egyptian foreman. The man was shouting, his face purple with exertion as he watched a team fail to move a single limestone slab. Dave did not speak. He knelt in the sand, drew a perfect circle with his finger, then added an axle through the center. He gestured to the heavy carts, then pointed at the sand. The Egyptian foreman tilted his head, stared at the drawing, and then back at the carts. A look of sudden realization broke across his face. He signaled his men. Within hours, the first wooden rollers were placed. The pace of construction shifted from a crawl to a gallop. Dust clouds rose as massive stones glided forward with effortless momentum. What was meant to take decades was achieved in weeks. The pyramids rose from the desert floor, sharp and imposing against the sky, completed in a flurry of impossible mechanical efficiency. The final stone was set with a rhythmic thud that echoed across the desert. The pharaoh sat upon a raised platform, gesturing for the wine to flow. He threw a grand party to honor the completion of his tomb, unaware that the work was done far too early. Thousands of laborers, now suddenly without purpose, retreated to the cooling shadows of the newly finished pyramids. They did not celebrate. Instead, they sat in tight, hushed circles, their hands no longer raw from stone, but instead balled into fists. The conversations grew louder, fueled by the realization of their own collective strength. Within days, the air in the camp shifted from exhaustion to aggression. They no longer looked at the pharaoh as a god, but as a man who had run out of chores for them. The guards stood by, but were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the organized workers. The crowd surged toward the palace gates, tearing down the ornate banners and forcing their way into the throne room. The pharaoh fled through a side passage as his reign crumbled. Dave watched the chaos from behind a stone pillar, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his machine. He leaned toward the fray, whispered, "My bad," to the empty air and scrambled into the cockpit. The machine groaned, sputtered, and vanished just as the palace doors splintered inward. The machine tore through the stone ceiling with a grinding screech, showering the hall in mortar and dust. It slammed into the center of a long banquet table, shattering plates of roasted pheasant and goblets of wine. Dave tumbled out of the cockpit, landing right in front of the medieval king. The room went silent. Then, a device slid from Dave's pocket and hit the floor, its screen glowing. A crisp, modern voice filled the hall, lecturing on the virtues of representative democracy and the necessity of the ballot. The medieval king leaned forward, his eyes wide, listening to every syllable about collective decision-making. He stood, knocking over his chair, his face flushed with sudden, dangerous inspiration. He slammed his fist onto the remaining table surface, declaring that every peasant in his realm would finally have a voice. The court erupted. Nobles shouted in protest while guards dropped their spears, confused by the sudden shift in law. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. The peasants, previously silent and subservient, began to gather in the courtyard, their voices rising in a roar of newfound political demand. The medieval king paced the dais, gesturing wildly as the entire structure of his kingdom dissolved into an unmanageable frenzy of debate and argument. The kingdom rushed to the polls, a frantic scramble of paper ballots and shouting peasants. The medieval king stood by, watching as the frantic debate led to a strange, sudden consensus. A stray goat wandering through the courtyard was hoisted onto the table by the laughing crowd, its hooves clattering against the wood. When the votes were tallied, the animal had won by a landslide. The medieval king looked at the creature, then at his advisors, and bowed. The goat was crowned with a velvet cushion, its bleating interpreted as a royal decree. Within minutes, the new monarch stared toward the horizon and let out a sharp, aggressive cry. The royal translator stepped forward, pale and trembling, announcing that the kingdom was at war with France. The nobles stood frozen, their mouths agape, unable to process the absurdity of a military campaign led by a farm animal. The French emissaries at the back of the hall turned and fled, too bewildered to mount a defense. Dave watched the scene from the shadows, shaking his head at the carnage of logic. He scrambled back into the cockpit of his machine as the royal guards began sharpening their pikes for a conflict that made no sense. He yanked the lever, and the banquet hall blurred into streaks of light, leaving the Goat King to his bizarre, impending conquest. The machine materialized with a violent shudder, slamming into the hard-packed dirt of a dusty frontier trail. Dave tumbled out, coughing as the engine hissed, venting steam into the blistering desert air. A cowboy sat on a nearby ridge, his hand resting on his holster as he watched the intruder with narrowed eyes. Dave stood up, his face slick with sweat, and pulled a tube of suntan lotion from his pouch. He walked toward the man, gesturing toward the sun, and held out the lotion as a gesture of relief. The cowboy recoiled, his face hardening into a mask of sudden hostility. He pointed a finger at the suntan lotion, shouting accusations of dark magic and unnatural charms. Within moments, the local townspeople emerged from the saloon in livery, brandishing garden tools and lighting torches against the midday glare. The silence of the desert was shattered by angry shouts and the rhythmic thud of boots on dry earth. Dave backed away, his hands raised, but the mob surged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He scrambled back into the cockpit, his fingers fumbling over the controls as pitchforks grazed the metal hull. The engine roared, spitting sparks onto the sand. Just as the first torch hit the roof, he jammed the lever forward, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze seconds before the crowd could reach him. The machine slammed into wet sand, throwing spray over a line of bunkers. Explosions rumbled in the distance, but the beach itself was unnervingly quiet. Dave stumbled out, clutching a crumpled bag of salt and vinegar chips. A WW2 soldier crouched behind a wooden barricade, his gaze fixed on the horizon until the sharp, acidic underscore scent of the snack cut through the smell of gunpowder. Dave held out a single chip. The WW2 soldier took it, tasted the salt, and his shoulders dropped. He let out a long, shaky breath, tears tracking through the grime on his face. He passed the bag to his comrades. Suddenly, the tension in the trench vanished. Men stopped checking their rifles, leaning back to savor the crunch, eyes closed in rare relief. But then, Dave tilted the bag. Nothing fell out. He shook it, turning it upside down, but only crumbs hit the sand. The WW2 soldier stared at the empty plastic. A collective moan rose from the trench. Without the salt and vinegar, the reality of the beach returned with crushing weight. Morale shattered instantly. Soldiers threw down their gear and sat in the mud, refusing to move. They were done. Dave clutched the empty bag, back toward his smoking machine, and scrambled inside as the entire defensive line dissolved into a puddle of snack-induced despair. The machine materialized in a flash of blinding neon, depositing Dave onto a platform of cold, polished metal. He stepped out, his boots clicking on the floor. Before him stood a future robot, its surface glowing with the shifting data streams. It didn't speak, but instead projected massive holographic headlines into the air. Dave looked up. The images flickered. The Egyptian pyramids were inverted, balanced on their points in the sand. A goat sat upon a throne wearing a heavy gold crown. Cowboys wearing sunscreen on the outside of their clothes, holding makeshift shields. The future was a chaotic mess of his own making. The future robot gestured toward a projection of a battlefield, then back to the inverted pyramids, its optical sensors pulsing with a rhythmic, judging light. Dave backed away, his gaze darting from one disaster to the next. The robot rotated its head, displaying a final, incriminating image of the WW2 beach, now filled with soldiers sitting in the mud staring at empty bags. Dave looked at his hands, then at the machine. He had not just visited history, he had broken it. The silence of the year 3000 was heavy, filled only by the hum of the robot's processors and the weight of his own profound, unintentional failures. Dave looked at the future robot and saw his own incompetence reflected in its cold, unblinking sensors. He had to fix it. He lunged back into the driver's seat, his fingers scrambling over the console. He smashed the reset button, but it stuck, cracked under the pressure of his grip. Smoke began to curl from the wiring, smelling of ozone and burnt oil. He kicked the throttle, desperate to jump back, but the machine only sputtered. It groaned, a deep, metallic sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The dials spun in frantic, erratic circles, needles snapping against their stops. He punched the navigation interface, then slammed his palm against the gear shift, trying to force it into reverse. The machine shuddered violently, throwing him against the side wall. Steam hissed from the pipes, filling the cabin with a white, blinding fog. Every bolt in the frame rattled as the engine whined at a pitch that hurt the ears. He hit the primary ignition, then the auxiliary, then every switch within reach. The world outside the viewport smeared into a chaotic streak of light and shadow. The floor dropped out from under him as the machine tore through the fabric of time. The roar of the engines reached a deafening crescendo, then snapped into a sudden, terrifying silence. The machine slammed into the damp earth with a bone-jarring thud. Steam hissed one final time before the engine died, leaving the clearing in absolute, stifling silence. Dave crawled out of the wreckage, his boots sinking into the soft, rotting leaves of the jungle floor. He looked at the console. The wires were charred, the dials were dark, and the power cell was cracked open. He was stranded. A low, rhythmic tremor began to pulse through the ground, vibrating the soles of his feet. He looked up. A shadow, immense and jagged, blotted out the sunlight, stretching across the entire clearing. The air grew cold as a massive scaled snout pushed through the dense canopy above. Dave did not run. He did not reach for a wrench or a button. He simply stood there, listening to the guttural, heavy breathing of the predator just inches away. He turned toward the lens, his face smeared with grease and dirt, and offered a small, defeated smile. He let out a soft, dry chuckle. "I should probably stop pressing buttons," he whispered. The shadow deepened as the creature opened its jaws, and the forest went quiet once more.